Welcome to the Horus Audiobook channel. Don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating content.
Hecate's Fountain by Kenneth Grant.
In the left side of Hecate is a fountain of virtue, which remaineth entirely within her, not sending forth its virginity. Chaldean Oracle.
Forward.
It would seem that almost all successful magic manifests as a ricochet, a sidekick to group ceremonies, to routine lodge or temple procedures, or to isolated individual magical workings. I call this peculiarity a tangential tantrum, anomalous, or otherwise. It does not appear to have been investigated by any previous occultist writing on the subject. It is probable that if the mechanism of the phenomenon could be surprised, magic would become at the last that which its exponents have claimed for it from the first, i.e., that it is a science rather than an art. Experience, however, persuades me that such a surprise lies beyond the realm of measurement, in which case the kind of occult occurrences herein described will continue to remain unpredictable. And perhaps it is just as well. Between the years 1955–1962, I was involved with an occult order known as New Isis Lodge. It functioned as a branch of the Ordo Templi Orientis, OTO, with headquarters in London. I founded the lodge to channel transmissions from transplutonic sources, and during the 7 years of its activities it transformed the OTO into the highly specialized vehicle of magical energy which Aleister Crowley had envisaged for it as long ago as 1945. It was my original intention to include here the lodge rituals themselves, but as this necessarily would have involved technicalities and repetitions, and as this book does not purport to be a manual of ritual magic, the intention has been abandoned. Instead, certain forms of tangential tantra sparked off by particular rites have been extracted from the annals of the lodge and edited where necessary to preserve textual continuity. Above and beyond this, the book endeavors to follow the workings of these phenomena in dimensions that scientists are only just beginning to explore. These dimensions, which may be considered as existing outside or between the two states of dreaming and waking, I have called the Mauve zone. It includes and excludes both states simultaneously. The designation comports occult overtones needing no explanation to those acquainted with the function of death as the gate of ingress and of egress to the other side of the tree of life. To those not so acquainted, the Mauve zone may be said to have a mythical analogue in the symbol of the Crimson Desert of the Arabs, which, according to Lovecraft, was the ancient equivalent of the Roba el Khalieh, a zone reputedly haunted by evil spirits and monsters of death. Part 1 of this book needs no comment. Part 2 requires some explanation because it is intended to illuminate a specific text, Crowley's Book of the Law, Liber Eal Vel Legist, which I have here interpreted with reference not to its mundane implications, but to its extraterrestrial provenance. As it is the first time this has been attempted, the reader is requested to exercise patience, as the skeleton is gradually stripped of its deceptively human appearance. This will be rewarded when he passes on to Part 3, where the hidden processes at work in the fabrication of Part 2 are more fully revealed. With the publication of this volume, the wheel has come full circle. The magical revival contained a list in which the names of certain entities mentioned in Crowley's Eal Vel Legis were comma paired with those appearing in Eal Azif, the Necronomicon, which latter, according to Lovecraft, was entirely a product of fantasy. More than a decade ago, in an article appearing in Man, Myth and Magic, I suggested a common source for both these books. The idea was taken up by various editors and compilers of grimoires, and no less than 4 versions of the Necronomicon have since been published. It is not therefore surprising that the present book touches again and further explores the affinities and identities lurking behind the shadowy masks of these two sphinxes. It also indicates some of the more pertinent researches of ufologists who suggest, perhaps with more likelihood than they even might care to admit, that the entities visualized by Crowley, Lovecraft, Castaneda, Bertio, and others really do exist somewhere and at some time, and that they occasionally put in an appearance here on Earth.
I believe there is a perichoresis, an interpenetration. It is possible, indeed, that we three are now sitting among desolate rocks by bitter streams. And with what companions? Arthur Machen.
Part 1. Magic of the Mauve Zone. 1. Objet d'art noir.
A great deal of misconception prevails today about talismans, fetishes, objects charged with prana, ojas, vril, tinana, or just plain magical power. It seems necessary to clear the ground, and I can think of no better way than basing my remarks upon actual objects preserved in the Magical Museum of New Isis Lodge. One such is a fragment of Egyptian mummy casing, purportedly that of an Egyptian priestess of the 26th dynasty. Remnants of the mummy swathings still adhere to its inner surface. The images of the ape of Thoth and of the jackal, sacred to Anubis, are clearly discernible. Shortly after the turn of the present century, the fragment was used as a psychic focus by one of the splinter groups of the Golden Dawn, directed by Soror SSDD. Her little book, Egyptian Magic, formed part of the series Collectanea Hermetica, edited by Dr. Wynne Westcott and published by the London Theosophical Society in 1896. New Isis Lodge came into possession of the fragment through the kindness of a collector who presented it in 1948. During the 50s, it was psychometrized by a gifted clairvoyant who refused to comment on it, whether from knowledge or ignorance is not known. At about this period, a woman named Mira joined the lodge. She was immediately drawn to the relic, although she had no more knowledge of its recent associations than had we of its ancient ones. She did suggest, however, that we might use it to form the basis of a rite designed to explore its magical history. The lodge room was therefore furnished as far as possible to accord with the period of the relevant dynasty, and the officiating priestess was an accomplished ritualist. Mira herself was a natural sensitive and had several times demonstrated her peculiar powers. Attired in appropriate robes, she was seated before a magic mirror set at an oblique angle against the mummy casing, so that two distinct images of it appeared simultaneously, one above the other. Lutes and pipes lent a lulling atmosphere to the proceedings, and it was not long before Mira's eyes assumed a void and distant expression. It is usual in such circumstances for the scryer alone to see images in the magic mirror. On this occasion, however, the officiating priestess, 7 acolytes, and a visiting priest from one of Gerald Gardner's covens saw the fading out of the reflected image and the abrupt introduction of animated entities enacting the following drama in the depths of the glass. A long object was wheeled by black-cowled figures into a tunnel which seemed to recede to infinity. It resembled a mobile divan, and upon it a woman, dazzlingly white, reclined upon cheetah pelts. Dangling paws and tails identified the latter, but there were additional attributes that were not physical, although they appeared in the reflection as substantially as those that were. They may have been ectoplasmic extrusions of the woman's past karmas. They coiled in drifts like interstellar dust, mushrooming and snowing down a luminous powder on the tunnel walls, where they formed curious deposits. When Mira finally surfaced, she described them as a sort of fantastic fungus. It covered the walls like a green moss imbued with malignant life, which swarmed over any surface that presented itself. These were many, because Mira's angle of vision continually shifted, so that new surfaces were exposed to view. The white woman on the trolley seemed to change color as a fungoidal tentacle reached out from the wall and explored her body. She resembled a bladder of transparent flesh inflated alternately with vapors of green, scarlet, mauve, and finally with an indigo-tinted fluid. The object of the performance remained obscure. No one could fathom the purpose of such colorful orgasms, for thus they appeared to be, judging by the expression of rapture on the face of the recumbent priestess. Here a slight digression seems necessary. It is possible that these colors had been ejaculated by alien entities and transmitted to Earth via the priestess who, in her magical sleep, was able to conduct the seed from outside. Having shed their venoms, the tentacles then ejected an impenetrable veil that obscured the vision. The only objects to emerge from the fog were the 2 original reflections of the mummy case fragment. Mira had been plunged into a profound trance and we waited for further manifestations. The visions so far had baffled us. They suggested that she had contacted through an ancient Egyptian priestess, a stratum infinitely more remote than that pertaining to the dynasty in which she had lived. It was just possible that Mira had tapped crisscross lines. There were transplutonic elements in the vision, and they seemed to have revealed, in a literal fashion, regions from which Lovecraft had received the fungi from Yuggoth. It was a vision of a time closer to the life of the mummified priestess than the period which followed it. The mirror then clouded over, as if particles of dust had settled upon the windscreen of Mira's spacecraft. Exquisite patterns of frost flowers presented themselves in rapid kaleidoscope. It was at first difficult to reconcile an impression of Arctic snows with the swart heat and dust associated with Old Egypt. Being interpreted, however, the phenomena symbolized on the one hand the austere virginity of the priestess, and on the other the torrid terrain which Karma had ordained as the scene of her interment. The period was identifiably that of the 13th dynasty, under the reign of Queen Sebek-Nefer-Ra, one of the greatest exponents of the draconian tradition within historic times. To anticipate events, it had become apparent that the hierarch of the mummy casing had also been an high priestess in a temple of Set, endowed by Queen Sebek-Nefer-Ra. The temple had survived ravages and depredations by the Osirians, who, for centuries, had sought to obliterate all traces of the abhorred Typhonian cult. The figure next to appear in the mirror was also recumbent, and in the process of undergoing treatment of a magical kind, reminiscent of a vision experienced by Joan Grant, with the difference that the plaque placed over the genitals of the priestess bore the hieroglyphic of a deity unknown to history, perhaps of one of those gods of the shadow at which Beatty hints. Again, the series of multiple orgasms, but this time an explanation readily suggested itself. The plaque became brilliantly incandescent as each orgasmic surge suffused its metal with vivid colors. The actual colors could be seen as rainbow halos, tossed off like rings grading through ultraviolet to an indescribable hue invisible to human eyesight. But it was registered by the mirror and transmitted to the lodge room, where it caused a smarting of the eyes and a curious sensation of weightlessness. One acolyte claimed, after the séance, that she had been physically levitated several inches above the floor. The scene again changed abruptly, and the mirror appeared to be enveloped by flame. A procession of hooded figures emerged from a tunnel. Their robes were black, but emblazoned with incandescent sigils that emanated a greenish radiance. The extraordinary part of it was that, as the procession emerged, it rained a greenish vapor into the lodge room. The mirror actually emanated a wave of chaos, which slowly enveloped Mira until she resembled a lichened stone statue. There was no accounting, physically speaking, for these subtle radiations, nor were any traces of them found on lodge furniture. It is therefore difficult to distinguish such visions from the random and irrational content of dreams. If color ever fell out of space, it fell that evening from the magic mirror into which Mira and other lodge members gazed. Another object, by no means as old as the mummy casing but as strongly charged with power, is the chandelier luster that was used as a blasting rod by Alan Bennett. He was also a member of the Golden Dawn and was instrumental in establishing the Buddhist Sangha in the West. He also taught Crowley many Oriental techniques of meditation and magic. It is a very ordinary-looking luster, now mounted on an ornate and gilded tripod. Bennett used it as an extension to his magical wand. There is no need for me to describe its power in Bennett's hands, because Crowley himself has already done so in his Confessions. An even more potent weapon is the magical dagger used by Crowley in his evocation of Choronzon. This occurred in the desert near Bou Saada in 1909, where, with Frater Lampada Tradam, Victor Neuburg, Crowley underwent a series of initiations into the ethers partially explored 2 centuries earlier by Dee and Kelly. I am told by psychically active individuals that the dagger has a decidedly sinister aura, and I would not hand it to a psychometrist, blindfold or otherwise. But the most uncanny magical object in the collection is undoubtedly an original portrait of Lam, an extraterrestrial entity which I selected, at Crowley's invitation, from one of his portfolios. The drawing somehow thrust itself forward, and it may be said without exaggeration that Lam chose me rather than vice versa. The portrait was shown in Greenwich Village, New York, around 1919 in an exhibition called Dead Souls. It was an apt designation, because Lamb comes straight out of the Necronomicon, so to speak. Merely to gaze into the eyes of this entity is to invite a potent contact. There follows an immediate sensation of lightness, of weightlessness, and then a sensation of falling. One's initial reaction is to resist being sucked into the vortex of an infernal astral funnel, all of which confirms the opinion of those who consider Lamb to be something or someone not of this earth. Speaking of extraterrestrials inevitably evokes, if not the great old ones, then their emissaries or minions. They sometimes mask themselves, like Machen's Gervais Craddock in deficient human forms. It was from such a source that I acquired a set of magical mannequins, which undeniably facilitate rapport with the old ones. The relics described above are magical engines of occult power. Some of them, like the portrait of Lamb, are more even than this, for they are also gateways to other dimensions, other worlds or ethers. Around them, cults are sometimes formed like the cult of Lamb, with which readers of these trilogies are acquainted. Power machines can manifest in quite innocent-seeming objects. In a modern grimoire which combines with lucky numbers, gambling, esoteric horse racing systems, and the more profound aspects of sorcery, the author refers to painted wooden boxes which he calls atua. Emblazoned upon them in appropriate colors are the sigils and seals of the lower or spirits to which they are consecrated. I have in my possession several such spirit abodes. The grimoire says that in the temples of lucky hoodoo and in the homes of those most favored by the spirits are to be found the painted boxes of the spirits. One of mine was painted by Zosvel Thanatos, whose magical touch was enough to consecrate a box to almost any spirit you could name. The others were embellished by Soror Iliarun, whose magical drawings and paintings are as well known as Spare's. The incident here related concerns one of the boxes painted by Iliarun. At the period in question, the box contained 4 of the small wooden figurines dedicated to the elemental minions of the great old ones. 1 for fire, 1 for water, the other 2 for air and earth, respectively. The mannequins were nourished periodically by the sacred dream mentioned in the grimoire, and being regularly replenished, they were very highly charged with magical mana and excessively active at astral levels. They slept in their atua, as the mummied dead sleep in their silent sarcophagi, embellished within and without with appropriate hieroglyphics. One of the mannequins had been dedicated to a space double in the cult of Hastur, Lord of the Air, or more properly, Lord of the Space Winds. Hastur's abode is deep outer space, which is represented in the mundane sphere by the element air, and, when close to Earth, as a rushing wind. One evening during the 3rd year of the esoteric activities of New Isis Lodge, this mannequin, which had been mislaid for several weeks, reappeared in an unexpected manner. Members of the lodge were performing a rite of the full moon, which involved the use of the Sebandrakalas. They had been successfully evoked and were manifesting to the rhythm and vibration of various woodwind instruments, mainly pipes. The goddess on this occasion was represented by an Asiatic high priestess named Li, who was almost totally ignorant of English, although her body responded perfectly to the language of the pipes. She was languid, lotus-eyed, and of the color of amber-dusted ivory. One of her 2 assistants in the ritual was Clander, whose name will be familiar to readers who remember the Water Witch episode. Her occult affinity with water made Clander an unfortunate choice, as the evening's proceedings were to prove. She lost consciousness at the climax of the rite, fell against the carved metal dais whereon Li was enthroned, and struck her head against the bas-reliefs, fantastic monsters of the deep more appropriate to Cthulhu's cult than to Hastur's. However, these considerations were then not at issue, and had no specific bearing on events which were purely routine procedures until Clander hit the dais. A trickle of blood from her earlobe, lacerated by the protruding tail of a sea monster, led to my finding the missing mannequin, which had evidently fallen from its atua and rolled behind the dais. I was about to retrieve it when Li surfaced from a swoon-like state of immobility. She implored me not to return the mannequin to its box. She had no English, as I have said, but her gestures were eloquent of imperious command. I instinctively obeyed. By this time the moon had passed its plenitude, and the object of the rite, which entailed the bottling of Callas, had been accomplished. Lee approached the altar and removed the box, taking care not to open the sliding lid. I could not understand the reason for her maneuvers, but deferred to them because she had been, until recently, in a powerfully oracular mood and had exhibited very fully and very perfectly the final phase of the lunar rite. But it was not until Clander came around that I knew something was seriously amiss, and that an undeniably potent force was building up in the lodge room. After most of the celebrants had left the premises, and I still could hear, faintly, a few interchanges of farewells floating up from the landing 2 floors below, I braced myself for a possibly fierce manifestation of post-ritual nerves which I had expected to sweep through the exhausted priestesses. What actually occurred involved an onslaught so concentrated in its fury that, had it run its course unchecked, it would undoubtedly have wrecked the building and, possibly, the entire neighborhood for miles around. It issued from that most innocuous object, the painted box. 5 of us in all witnessed the ensuing manifestation. The box lay unattended on the dais where Lee had placed it. She had succumbed to sleep after her exertions, and someone who had returned unnoticed from the landing below, quite unwittingly, slid back the lid, and all hell broke loose. First, a slight breeze pervaded the lodge room. It mounted to a strong draught and scattered some papers spread upon a table in a corner of the room. Then, without further warning, an incredible gale arose and swung the heavy curtains on their brass rings and soon achieved the momentum of a hurricane. It became virtually impossible to breathe, and panic terror fused itself with the raging airstream. The central lantern, suspended by a massive chain above the altar, threatened to crash against the ceiling as it heaved in the storm. Glancing through the one tiny window high in the northern wall, I noticed that not a single leaf stirred in the garden outside. The night was utterly calm. Within, the lashing wind sucked into its funnel all objects that lay in its path. Clander, hysterical, was literally blown to the dais. She had the presence of mind, however, to grab the box, return to its confines the magical mannequin, and force back the lid. Only the demon will of the woman, bastioned no doubt by the energies evoked by the rite, enabled her to shut the box. Immediately, perfect stillness, and a silence that seemed terrifyingly artificial, judging from the general tone of letters, I receive from omniscient occultists the world over. I imagine I shall be informed that this is all easily explicable, so I will warn the unwary, if there be any, that there is a sequel to this incident. Clander, as has been recorded elsewhere, died at sea, claimed perhaps by the Deep Ones. Some months after the episode here described, Lee fell from the air when a plane carrying her over Central Asia crashed against mountains. Was she also claimed by the elemental minions? But it was the following incident that caused members to begin referring to such episodes as the Annals of the Black Lodge. This incident too originated as a sidekick or tangential tantrum of routine ritual. Members of New Isis Lodge met every 7th Friday, and part of the preamble consisted of an exchange of experiences in various fields of magical, mystical, and spiritual culture. We had as a guest of honor on this particular occasion a quite remarkable individual known only to the few in the more reserved of occult circles. He was one of those rare souls who had devoted the major part of his life to the study of alchemy. This man had introduced me some years earlier to a South Indian tantric deeply versed in the art of Srividya, TM. One of the candidates for the alchemist's Kaula circle was the water witch, Clander. Her glamours had deflected even him, to such an extent that his original oath of brahmacharya, taken in the presence of his guru several years previously, appeared to be in jeopardy. He therefore asked me to act as a lightning conductor, to bear the brunt of possible short-circuitings. The lodge room had been rigged in an extensive underground network of apartments, which formed the basement of a deceptively small shop in one of the side streets off a main West End thoroughfare. The alchemist, who was also the shop's proprietor, was an initiate of the Gomaya Diksha, which had rendered him eligible for his impending initiation into the inner circle of the Kaula chakra, an advanced degree involving the practice of Lambika yoga. Clander, with her hypersex-centered personality, had, through participation in various magical workings, a fairly shrewd idea of the occult advantages inherent in such an initiation. it is unnecessary to enlarge upon this aspect of the episode, beyond mentioning the fact that the alchemist no doubt represented a pawn in one of her schemes. The lodge room was prepared for the performance of a type of lycanthropic and necromantic sorcery, associated with two specific tunnels of Set. Imagine, therefore, a miniature though more complex version of the Dashwood Caves with, in lieu of, the various grottos provided for sensual dalliance, a series of shell-shaped cells like petrified vortices, designed with the sole purpose of attracting into their convolutions the occult energies of Yuggoth, and of focusing them through the Caelus of New Isis, represented by a gigantic vesica-shaped prism. The decor was weird in the extreme, the illuminations cunningly arranged to impart a sinister and shifting play of light and shade, combined with ordial images suggestive of rushing waters and whistling astral winds. An altogether eerie atmosphere created by a few deft touches of supreme artistry. The place was the epitome of twilight, and of those equivocal states of consciousness peculiar to the werewolf, the vampire, and the ghoul, whose subtle presences were suggested by various ingenious devices. In this elusive atmosphere, Clander appeared as a squamous teratoma, swimming in an arid sea of blood-streaked etheric substances, pullulating with the unwholesome currents of the Qliphoth. The alchemist, recumbent on a slab of stone adorned with emblems of the great old ones, had assumed the death posture and awaited the kiss of the goddess, whom he had evoked by the peculiar mode of his death. He had petitioned her to appear to him and to confer upon him in his magical sleep the supreme siddhis. Thus far the rite and the various celebrants were adequately fulfilling their respective roles. But things did not proceed so smoothly. Clander had unconsciously harbored in her aura the remnants of rapport with questionable entities engendered by her past association with a witch cult. The connection was now reactivated, and it caused a sudden violent conflict in her psyche. I felt the shock of it, but I was totally unprepared for the eruption of black energy that accompanied its awakening. Emerging from the trance into which the rite had thrown her, Clander shrieked, rushed raving about the premises, and grabbed a dagger which lay in a part of the building not then in use. Her action may have resulted merely in a temporary disruption of the rite, but the weapon in question happened to be the magical weapon used by Aleister Crowley in his evocation years earlier of Choronzon, whom Crowley once described as the first and deadliest of all the powers of evil. Alive to the danger of the situation, I made to seize the weapon, noticing as I did so that the alchemist was clutching his breast and writhing on the slab as if suffering the pangs of an excruciating immolation. Clander tripped and fell as the dagger, now unsheathed, clattered onto the slab. The alchemist later told me that he had at that moment seen a hooded shape hovering over him, about to inject into his heart the venom that flowed from its eyes in a jet of mauve. This was my first introduction to the necromancies in Mauve that were to recur persistently throughout the history of New Isis Lodge. Mauve is one of the colors ascribed to the false Sephira Dath. Its outpouring as a color, in a rite having overtones of necrophily, was to prove significant, for it enabled me, at a later period, to penetrate the Lovecraftian gnosis with special reference to the mysteries of the abominable plateau of Leng. It also gave me insight into the magical function of three major nocturnal phantoms: the werewolf, which transforms the Caelus of day into those of night, the vampire, which drinks the Caelus, and the ghoul, which eats the etheric substance of these Caelus on their way to becoming flesh, thus inhibiting full reification in the light of day. This suggests the triumph of dream or irrationality over reason or waking state consciousness. It was several years, however, before I was able to evolve from these insights the systematized formulae of dream control schematized in Nigd side of Eden and subsumed to the system of grades in the O.T.O. For hidden behind these demonic images there lies a supreme power zone of magical energy. Crowley hinted at it in his writings. Lovecraft shrank from it, appalled. Like the bat, the supreme totem of this nocturnal current, the system appears upside down to those who are unfamiliar with the modes of protoplasmic reversion peculiar to its mysteries. For the mage of the Mauve necromancies is, in his way, like the Hindu sage. What is day to the common man is night to the sage, and vice versa. It is worth noting that in the entire gamut of kalas or colors listed in Liber 777, mauve in various shades appears only in connection with paths 17 and 28 of the Sephirotic tree. The symbolism of these paths is in turn connected with the letter Zain and with Aquarius, respectively. These are glyphs of the present aeon or age, Aquarius, and of the wordless aeon to which reference has already been made. Note also 17 as 71 in reverse, 71 being the number of Lam, the silent or wordless way. 17 and 28 together make 45, the I, number of ADM, man, whose perfect manifestation is expected to occur between these two aeons. But there is an earlier meaning of ADM which signifies the red man, and which applies to the female being identical with the lunar current manifesting as the menstrual kalas.
2. The Cult of the Coup.
The priestess Li was my link with the curious cult of the Coup, which originated in southeastern Asia. Its interest in the present context lies in the fact that the heart of the cult enshrines a system analogous to the voodoo mystère of the 256 venoms, or kalas, of the goddess. In the Coup cult, the kalas are ostensibly used for acquiring wealth and/or for encompassing vengeance. But they also have deeper and magical uses. The hieroglyph Coup comports many meanings, foremost of which is black magic, in contrast to the white variety known as Wu. As an ideograph Coup is at least 3,000 years old, it denotes a magical principle generated by licentiousness, a principle that controls the spirits of those who have died a violent death or who have morally degenerated through excessive sensuality. It is in some respects the Chinese equivalent of the mystère du zombieisme. Its magical instrument is the basin, bowl, or water vessel, and its zoomorphic totems are the insect, worm, snake, frog, centipede, etc. As the commentary of Tso Chuan has it, vessel and worms make Q caused by licentiousness. Those who have died violent deaths are also Q. The basic concept of Coup is preserved in the White King, where it appears as the 18th hexagram. The textual comment supplied by Leger and others is generally obscure, but the two elemental trigrams comprising the hexagram are those of earth and air and therefore in accord with the meaning of Coup as causing a loss of soul or breath. This accords well with the ancient Chinese texts, wherein Coup is identified with malignant atmospheric conditions such as those generated physically by swamps and mephitic subterranean regions, or psychically by the miasmic effluvia of charnel conditions. Coup also indicates the presence of evil spirits and the unwholesome auras of artificial entities created by black magic. What is of special interest here is the fact that according to some extremely ancient texts, the Coup flies about by night and appears like a meteor. Its luminosity increases, and it projects a human-shaped shadow. It is then known as Fiaoshenku. The shadow can develop a degree of density that enables it to copulate with women, at which stage it is called Qinzanku. It can then go wherever it pleases, and it is said to spread calamity throughout the countryside. Popular belief envisaged the Coup as a malignant haunter of the dark who snatched the souls of the dead. Such beliefs gave rise to accounts of calm nights oppressed by heavy clouds, wherein unrecognizable objects were seen to glitter and streak, like meteors over the rooftops, and to fly off into space. Such lights were ascribed to the Coup, and the Coup was apt to devour on its nocturnal forays the brains of children. It also kidnapped human spirits. In the families of sorcerers, which were known to keep Coup, the women were always debauched by these spirits. The meteor was identified as the flying Coup or the snake Coup, an oblique reference to the Ophidian current, which ancient initiates knew to have entered Earth's atmosphere from outside. The circle of sorcerers which serves this poisonous spirit becomes rich. This belief is reminiscent of its voodoo equivalent in the serpent goddess Aida Wedo, of whom it is said, "My serpent goddess, when you come, it is like the lightning flash." The spirit of Aida Wedo is a large serpent that appears only when it wants to drink. It then rests its tail on the ground and thrusts its mouth into the water. It is said that he who finds excrement of this serpent is rich forever. From the fact that the women and girls of the family, circle, are said to be debauched by the snake, it is evident that the Ophidian current manifests its venoms through calyx of the female. The snake flits nocturnally like a meteor. When it reaches sparsely inhabited regions, it descends and eats the brains of men. Such cannibalized mortals become zombies. Brains signify intelligence, which in turn is symbolic of the vital principle. A spirit similar to the Sibin Coup appears in the form of a toad or frog. Both the Batrachian and the Ophidian forms are familiar to sorcerers as totems of the Deep Ones and of the Great Old Ones. It is worth noting here that the Coup, like the UFO, seems to avoid populous areas. It lands or earths itself in deserted regions. Another similarity with UFO lore is that the occupants of such crafts sometimes abscond with various parts of the human body. The ancient Chinese were compelled to embody their observations in a magical context, for want of terms, to describe phenomena of extraterrestrial origin. The insistence on insect symbolism is highly significant in view of the humming sound, believed to herald the proximity or advent of the Old Ones. There is yet another type of Coup. It was fabled to excrete gold and silver and to dart about nocturnally like lightning. A great noise causes it to fall. UFOs also are said to fall in a great rush of sound. Furthermore, it may be a snake, toad, or any kind of insect or reptile. It is kept by its votaries in a secret room and is fed by the women. However, it is formed of pure yin, which is a figurative manner of saying that it is a vampire Coup which lives on menstrual blood. It is also said in this connection that the Coup which devours men will excrete gold, while that which devours women will excrete silver. The key to this saying is to be sought in the symbolism of Chinese alchemy and interpreted in the light of the Ophidian gnosis. It then reads, "The vampire Coup female that draws off the male seed as incubus emanates the solar or creative kala. The vampire Coup male that imbibes the menstrual blood as succuba emanates the lunar or destructive venom. The process divides itself naturally into magic sun and witchcraft moon. But the lunar kala is not always destructive or corrosive, any more than the solar current is invariably creative. There are infinite gradations. The Chinese were aware of a subtle perichoresis, or interpenetration of dimensions, and the Coup was perhaps one of the forms in which they typified it. Yet in nearly all cases, the process involved a sexual interchange between mortals and extraterrestrials, between sorcerers, meteors, or lightning. The saucer symbolism is also implicit in the dual symbol of the Coup, which comprises the basin or vessel and the worm or insect. The solar and lunar spirits copulate in the waters contained in the basin, thus imbuing the fluid with the kalas from outside. The Yikibien Chipu lists 4 kinds of Coup: snake Coup, Chinsan Coup, centipede Coup, and frog Coup. They can change their forms or become invisible. They each have consorts with which they copulate at fixed intervals in a vessel containing water. The venoms thus released float upon the surface of the water and are collected with a needle. The infusion is known as the breath or spirit of yin and yang and is then injected during nocturnal visitation into the victim's genitals. The vital principle is thus overpowered, and the victim becomes a zombie, his ghost being henceforth controlled by the Coup, just as the tiger enslaves the Chang. This somewhat lengthy diversion has been necessary in order to explain the curious events which transpired at a meeting of New Isis Lodge when Lee officiated in a rite of the Coup interpreted along new aeon lines. The lodge room was draped in yellow silk, shot with mauve. Lee took up her position on a carved ebony throne upholstered in mauve. She wore a robe of black silk blazoned with an emerald serpent and girdled with satin ropes, also mauve. Her sandal straps were in the form of frogs wrought in green jade. In lieu of the usual altar stood a large tank filled with tinted fluid, in which swam several delusively realistic devices suggestive of the Deep Ones or their minions. A large bronze gong was struck to mark the stages of the ritual that ensued. Lai was sunk in deep trance. Her body swayed rhythmically, like the delicate stalk of a black lotus etched against the brilliant yellow silk. An almost inaudible crooning proceeded from the hood, through the slits of which Lee's eyes gleamed from their magical sleep. Her fingers were exceptionally long and tipped, with brilliant lacquers that reflected the light beams flashing from the jeweled lantern, swaying slightly in the shadows above the throne. It was a metal-wrought lantern of Arabic craftsmanship, its alternate windows glazed with various colored panels that threw heavy shadows about the room and directed one emerald beam into the depths of the tank. 8 hooded figures encircled the throne and swayed in time to the clamoring gong. Its reverberations created a vacuum that seemed to suck into the room a curious whine, as of insects whose invisible presences became increasingly palpable. The circles of votaries closed upon Lee like a dark sea, encroaching upon a vivid yellow strand. Her crooning had risen from a low and lilting repetition of 2 or 3 notes to a highly pitched falsetto resembling the shriek of whippoorwills or the squealing of bats. The hypnotic intensity of the gong, combined with the mounting concentration of incense coiling from dragon-shaped censers, evoked an atmosphere redolent of the bizarre, wherein the incident that ensued appeared, to the participants, as a vivid reality. At the climax of the rite, Lee shed her robe and, like a white shadow, incredibly reptilian, slithered over the rim of the tank. As her form clove the waters, 8 phallic feelers reached up and seized her. They engaged her in a multiple mythuna, in which each tentacle participated in turn. Lee's hair, black as night, formed a slowly waving arabesque, each vivid tendril etched against the mauve zone with Delinean precision. The 8-fold orgasm that finally convulsed her was registered by the votaries around the throne. Violent, paroxysms displaced the black hoods, revealing bald shining heads and the protuberant eyes of the batrachian minions of Cthulhu. This transaction occurred only in the depths of the mauve zone, for on the dais Lee's figure, still hooded, sat slumped in a heap like a pool of oil on the point of oozing down the legs of the throne. As the image gathered intensity in the minds of the acolytes, the shadows cast by the lantern assumed upon the floor an almost tangible and Ophidian animation. Slowly, the oleaginous undulations approached the tank and began ascending its walls. The mauve radiance shone through them and made of each pullulent form a bladder of dully glowing garnet, an elongated sac of pus infused with peculiar venom. When the shadows reached the lip of the tank, they dripped into its depths and merged with the green-rayed fluid. At the touch of this new element, the Coup form of Lee emerged from the embrace of that octopoidal Yab-Umand, streaked suddenly throneward, describing a perfect parabola as the spirit penetrated the limp mass upon the throne and identified itself once more with the hooded, empty shell. In that lightning-swift return, the Coup revealed itself as a marine reptile midway between snake and fish. Lee's experience confirmed some, if not all, of the main findings of 2 scholars who contributed an article on Chinese magic to the Journal of the University of Pennsylvania in 1933. The more important phase, however, with its extraterrestrial implications, remained unsuspected by them. The sequel to the rite contained elements which suggested that Chinese sages possessed particular occult knowledge that preceded any so-called scientific evidence of extraterrestrial intervention in the affairs of humanity. The shadow substance that seemed to come alive and crawl into the tank was indeed some sort of ectoplasmic oil secreted within Lee's robe, her cast-off snakeskin. It had left a deposit upon the throne and a trace of slime upon the walls of the tank that emitted a faint but high-pitched whine when dissolved in acid. As previously noted, the Coup was identified with the 18th hexagram of the Yi King. The vessel or tank is typified by the trigram symbolizing the element earth. It appears like a lid above the trigram of space or air, thus containing, arresting, or capturing that element. In this containment, the element discharges its vitality or seed, as the worm Ophidian current in the saucer. Crowley, who worked for many years with the system of the White King, compared hexagram 18 with its reflection, hexagram 53, which is composed of the trigrams of air of earth. This suggests sea flying, as earth of air suggests choking. The latter well suggests suffocation by swamp or marsh gas, and by poisons emanating from miasmic callus, typified by the venoms of the Coup snake.
3. Passens in Mauve.
Excellent and comparatively recent exam peelis of tangential magic occurred in connection with the Babylon working, performed by John W. Parsons shortly before Crowley's death in 1947. Parsons' intention was to evoke an elemental creature having, among other characteristics, red hair and green eyes. He devised a conjuration based upon Dr. Dee's Enochian system. An entity responded in the form of Marjorie Cameron, who fulfilled the necessary requirements. She later claimed to be an incarnation of Babylon and also to be pregnant with a child mightier than all the kings of the earth. For the first part of this history, I have drawn upon letters written by John Parsons to Cam Aaron during the late 1940s, and letters written during 1952 and 1953 by Cameron to Jane Wolfe. The second part, a part probably unknown to Cameron, dates from 1955 and is still ongoing. On February 28, 1946, Frate Jopan performed an invocation in the Mojave Desert, California. A force which he intuited as Babylon responded, and it was not long before it obsessed him and commanded him to write the Book of Babylon, Liber 49, which described itself as the fourth chapter of the Book of the Law. This it claimed on the ground that it represented the final phase of the formula of Tetragrammaton, the phase which stands for the daughter aspect of Godhead. It therefore purported to complete and perfect Ale, which had terminated with the third chapter containing the proclamation of Horus, the sun aspect. The force that possessed Parsons in the desert claimed to be Nuit, the incestuous sister of Rahur-Quit, who speaks through the third chapter of the Book of the Law. Parsons claimed that she instructed him to seek her in the seventh air, which he did. He also found that, among other things, he was expected to undertake a black pilgrimage and publish the secret matter of the adepts thou knowest. Furthermore, there is mention of the work of the spider and the snake, zootypes that have been explained exhaustively in these trilogies. It was Parsons' belief that the Book of Babylon contained the record of a magical experiment relating to the invocation of an elemental, and thereafter of the goddess of force called Babylon and the results thereof. He believed also that the aeon of Horus ushered in by Ael related to fire and to Mars, which he interpreted in terms of war and similar violences, to the sun as power and energy, and also to the child. The manifestation of the child he recognized in the destruction of old institutions and ideas, the discovery and liberation of new energies, and the trend towards power governments, war, homosexuality, infantilism, and schizophrenia, a surprisingly precise picture of today's society. He was also imbued with the belief that this pretty picture would be improved somewhat by the counterbalancing force of Babylon, which would embody love, understanding, and Dionysiac freedom. Parsons nurtured a profound conviction that this counterforce was historically incarnate in a living woman as a direct result of his Babylon working. That he did not identify this woman with Cameron is clear from a letter in which he wrote, "I know that Babylon is incarnate upon earth at this moment, although I do not know where or as whom. I believe she will manifest in her proper time." Parsons expressed his general attitude to magic, and to ritual magic in particular, in several letters to Cameron. He brought out the distinction between its art and its science. High invocation of lesser forces, spirit, angel, demon, elemental, is exact, and since love does not usually enter in so much in one sense, it is far more dangerous than invocation of gods. In the higher work you are actually wooing the god, it is an act of art. In the lower you are compelling, it is an act of science. And again, the primary methods are Goetia, demonic; 2, planetary, clavicle of Solomon; 3, Enochian, elemental and Aries; 4, solar, guardian angel. I have found the Enochian the best, although complicated. The tarot corresponds to the Enochian system obtained by Dr. Dee, the trumps to the Aries, the court cards to the gods, seniors and angels, and the numbers to the lesser angles. The ritual of the Bornless One, Parsons noted that it was liable to produce dangerous side phenomena and sometimes permanent haunting in an area where it is repeated. He described it significantly as a Sumerian ritual of the same period as the formula of Inanna and the Anunnaki. Parsons favored a simple and direct approach to magic. He realized that systems such as the Enochian and Gnosticism upon which Crowley drew heavily, were too complex to appeal directly to the individuals he most desired to enthuse and to enlist in the program of thelemic freedom which he envisaged. He thought that Christianity, although false, had triumphed over Gnosticism because of its simpler and more direct appeal. It should be remembered that Parsons had to deal with Americans, a people divorced from the classical ethos in which Crowley and earlier magicians had been steeped. Simplicity has been the key to victory in all the idea wars, claimed Parsons, and at present, magic does not have it. There is the skeleton in the rites of man, and the coverings in the main literature, but the true body has never been shown forth. Even so, Liber 49 is not simple, is poorly structured, replete with grammatical and orthographical errors, and hardly worthy to rank beside AL, let alone to stand as its fourth and final chapter, and so far as concerns appealing to the masses, hopeless. Nevertheless, it is of some historic interest as containing several accurate prophecies, including an unequivocal indication of the ordeals that lay ahead of him, the black pilgrimage, and the mode of death by flame. It also prophesied Cameron's wanderings and the conception of the child that was to be bomb in the Mauve zone, not 9 months but 9 years later. The error in timing, i.e., 9 years instead of 9 months, is typical of a combination of the expected with the unexpected, and is peculiar to most tangential magical phenomena. In his letter to Cameron, Parsons refers to the passage of the warrior that lies just 1 inch beyond the possible and in which magical attainment is experienced. He describes the process in terms reminiscent of Austin Spare and, more recently, of Carlos Castaneda, though both writers were unknown to Parsons. For instance, he describes the going down of the ego between the adamant or malefic backside of the gods. To go deep, you must reject each phenomenon, each illumination, each ecstasy, going ever downward until you reach the last avatars of the symbols that are also the racial archetypes. He furthermore asserted that neurosis and initiation are the same thing, except that neurosis stops short of apotheosis, and the tremendous forces that mold all life are insisted, short-circuited, and turned poisonous. Psychoanalysis transforms the false ego symbols and exteriorizes them into false social symbols. It is a confusion of conformity and cure in terms of group behavior. Parsons wrote of the goddess Kali, the Hindu counterpart of Babylon. She is black, murderous, and horrible, but her hand is uplifted in blessing and reassurance, the reconciliation of opposites, the apotheosis of the impossible. In 1955, Cameron played the part of Kali in Kenneth Anger's film The Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, which was ostensibly about Aleister Crowley. Among her co-stars were people with whom she performed the weird rituals which she mentions in her letters to Jane Wolfe, rituals which led, she believed, to the fulfillment of the prophecy concerning the child mightier than all the kings of the earth. In order to interpret this prophecy, it is necessary to understand that the expression kings of the earth has a special connection, and in more than one sense, with the current 93. For instance, it refers to the 10th degree OTO members, of which are known as kings, and to whom are allotted various terrestrial zones over which they exercise occult jurisdiction. The sphere of Earth is symbolized by the sign, hence X, and its control by the E-kings. Mightier than the kings implies therefore the one beyond 10, viz. 11 or Exideg. This is a reference to the star of the A-E, the star of Sirius or Set, which contains the sevenfold star of Babylon expected by Cameron. She had used, in a literal fashion, the formula of Tetragrammaton for the purpose of creating the necessary conditions of conception to which she alluded several times in her letters to Jane. Had she added to the Star of Babylon the formula of Tetragrammaton, Cameron would have beheld the 11-fold star of Set, which is what in fact appeared in the Mauve zone in 1955, when New Isis Lodge was founded as an inner cell of the O.T.O. The radiations of the chalice of the 11-fold star were received through the prism of the lodge, which was dedicated to this new form or incarnation of Babylon, Kali, or Isis. Parsons' observations on life are, again, reminiscent of Austin Spare's. We live a symbol of what we know it is, and finally transcending the symbol become one with it. This is the wisdom of the cavemen that we have lost. It was their sanity. The lack of it is our madness. We no longer know how to act, and having lost the symbol, we have lost the reality. Not by logic, nor by intellect, nor by reason can we regain it, but by wild dances, solemn rites, and chants in unknown tongues. Only in the irrational and unknown direction can we come to it again. Cameron was to enter that irrational and unknown direction in her fantastic flight through magical realms several years after Parsons had been devoured by flame. She did indeed wander in the witchwood under the night of Pan, as prophesied in Liber 49, and she knew some of the mysteries of the goat and the serpent, but it is nowhere apparent that she knew the identity of the children that are hidden away. This phrase refers to the magical mannequins, nourished in the silence and darkness of the Atua. The various copies of Liber 49 that I have seen are lacking 4 verses, but what remains leaves no doubt as to the nature of the way mapped out for Cameron. It was not the solemn way or the reasoned way, but the wild, free way of the eagle, and the devious way of the serpent, and the oblique way of the factor unknown and unnumbered. The oblique way recalls Spare's precarious funambulatory pathway between ecstasies. The factor unknown is an echo of Ael the 3, 2. The unnumbered way calls for more explicit interpretation. It is a direct pointer to the silent aeon of Zain. As in Nichiman 7, the number of Babylon's star. It is also the letter attributed to Path 17 of the Sephirotic tree, which is reflected into the tunnels of Set as the way of Lamb, which, being wordless, is also unnumbered. To Path 17 is ascribed the Mauve Kyla in the color scale of the double feminine, mother and daughter Kylas. To it also is ascribed the Kyla of Wormwood, with which Cameron identified her star. At the time he received Liber 49, Parsons could not have been aware of certain letters written by Frater Achad, which came to light after Parsons' death. In them, Achad expressed doubt as to Crowley's having uttered the word of the aeon of Horus because, having identified himself with the beast, he was speechless, and in some inexplicable manner not yet clearly understood, the aeon of Horus itself has become merged with the wordless aeon. In the Book of Antichrist, Parsons wrote, describing the Black Pilgrimage, Babylon called on me again, and I began the last work. That was the work of the wand. And I worked for 17 days, until Babylon called me in a dream, in an astral working. Then I reconstructed the temple, and began the Black Pilgrimage as she instructed. And I went into the sunset with her sign, and into the night past accursed and desolate places and Cyclopean ruins, and so came at last to the city of Chorazin. And there a great tower of black basalt was raised, that was part of a castle whose further battlements reeled over the gulf of stars. And upon the tower was this sign, as noted in Nightside of Eden, Chorazin is the city of Babylon, as Choronzon is the city of the beast. Both names contain the child as the Chor-Har or Horus, and the wordless aeon as the Zain or Zem. Chorazin is mentioned in the Necronomicon in a passage alluding to the liars in wait who form the ring-pass knot within the city itself. Aleister Crowley, Charles Stansfeld Jones, John W. Parsons, Marjorie Cameron, Soro Andahadna, Michael Bertio, and Kenneth Grant all are links in the Sirius Mart chain. The link represented by Cameron threw off a tangential loop which pulled into the sphere of the double current the direct radiations of the Mauve zone by incarnating an elemental that was to open a gate which had remained sealed since the aeon of Azin. Parsons died in June 1952. 6 months later, in a series of letters to Jane Wolfe, Cameron claimed that she had been through one of the strangest and wildest voyages into the unknown that has ever been told. Because of it, she was considered insane and shunned by all but a peculiar few. She claimed that the Babylon work which Parsons had begun in 1946 set in motion the second part of a great force which was divided into 3. Aleister C. Crowley began the first, 3 years before I was born. I never knew the man, yet his desire gave me birth. His paternity sings in my veins. The stage was set for a great magical operation, begun at the time that Crowley was undergoing his supreme ordeal on the way to attaining the grade of Ipsissimus in 1924. This happened to be also the birth time of the present author, who later became Aosic Iwas 718 and Crowley's successor as outer head of the Ordo Templi Orientis. Thus, like Cameron Parsons, Aleister too was engendered by the magical operations set in motion by Crowley in the Mauve Zone. They flashed into Earth's atmosphere and, for a brief period, erupted at Cefalù, Tunisia, and Chelles. Writing to Jane Wolfe about a memory of her childhood in the northernmost part of Wisconsin, a country of ferocious grandeur, Cameron mentions a well, which she always believed to be the hole to hell. This surely is an oblique allusion to a dark gate to the Mauve Zone, sealed long ages earlier by Dakota Indians, a memory upwelling in her present life cycle. In the same letter she alludes to "my star, the wormwood star, which shall be born this summer solstice of the year 1953. Cameron believed that the war engine referred to in AL 111-7 was the flying saucer, and that through her intermission and by means of these war engines, her peculiar few would be transported to Mars, which I believe is somehow my home. Earth will explode in a collision of the two star islands, which are reported now moving towards each other in the heavens, and resulting therefrom, my star, the great seven-pointed star of Babylon, shall be born in the heavens. The star was not born at the summer solstice, 1953, nor at any other known time, but in 1955, the 11-pointed star of Set, beyond Yuggoth, the star known as New Isis, began transmitting the vibrations that were received by New Isis Lodge at that time. These transmissions lasted 7 years, and their results are embodied in my double trilogy, and in a certain secret grimoire known as the Book of the Spider, which will remain unpublished until a predestined throne has been ascended. As explained, the star was 11, not 7-pointed, because the tetragrammaton had been included in its formula. Cameron repeatedly alluded to the manner in which she had conceived the star child, but she did not understand its energies as distinct entities supplementing her sevenfold nature. It is therefore necessary at this stage to inquire into the precise significance given by Cameron to this formula. She was well aware that the supreme secret of magical power lies in the secret aeon, represented by the lunar current, which manifests through the kalas of the menstrual fluids. The lunar current is one of the two major keys which, in her letters to Jane, Cameron anthropomorphizes as King Solomon and Queen Sheba, the seed and the magnet. According to Cameron, the Jews distorted the idea of the seed and secreted it in the pantacle, coin, hence their power over the money elementals the world over. Furthermore, they sealed this pact by the rite of circumcision, in which she saw a symbol of fellatio, the technique used by the priestess to draw off the vital solar energy required by the secret rite. Cameron also maintained that the Africans had twisted the science of the lunar kalas into blood taboos, caste system, and voodoo cannibalism. Genuine magical cannibalism, as she declared, concerns the devouring of the real source of power, I. To the lunar kalas, whether as perfumes or flowers for the dead, for ghouls, attributed to the element air, as vital fluids for vampires, attributed to water, or as material essences for cannibals, attributed to earth. She cites the term fish queen, which denotes practitioners of cunnilingus, and which derives its significance from the secret of the womb itself, wherein snakes and fish swim, the memory of all evolution. The kalas contain the secretions and the secret aeons, which form the links of the evolutionary catena. They epitomize the subconsciousness of the race and its emergence from aquatic life to dry land, dreaming to waking consciousness. Protoplasmic. Reversion can be effected by a magical viparita of the kalas, which are then absorbed by the sorcerer, as in Austin Spare's formula of atavistic resurgence. The essence of the matter may be summed up as follows. The emissaries of the Old Ones seek nourishment of a kind that is available on Earth only via the lunar kalas of the nubile human female. This is not to say that their interest in our planet is wholly material, it is not, but it does highlight a fact that is not generally known, which is that specifically human elements are vital to their sustenance, and that they may be obtained in sufficient quantity only from certain hitherto unsuspected sources. In respect of cannibalism, Underhadner's article The Feast of the Hive describes an elaborate symbolic rehearsal of an operation which she has dramatized for purposes of art and of concealment. Her painting, demon feast, and the morbid necrophilic repast celebrated by the sorcerers on the plateau of Leng are but different modes of representing and of veiling identical rites. It is worth noting in this Lovecraftian context that Cameron lived as a child in the northernmost part of Wisconsin, which is a region associated with the Cthulhu cycle of myths through August Derleth. The region contains a lake which covers a gate to the Mauve zone, to which snake cultists directed by Michael Bertio resort at certain times of the year in order to invoke the deep ones. Like Austin Spare, Cameron associated with a witch woman who had occult affiliations with ancient Indian cults that had retained unbroken a secret tradition of traffic with the great old ones. The Narragansetts of the New England region, the Adena of Ohio, and the Lenape-Dogrib Indians of California are known to have forged links with entities spawned in the Mauve zone and in the outer rings of Yuggoth. During her sojourn in the Mojave Desert, Cameron's latent psychic faculties were reactivated. She wrote to Jane Wolfe concerning a third beam of hearing. For some months now, I have been aware of the heightening intensity of what I call a third beam of hearing. I can describe it as the sound of a radio beam that one picks up on shortwave. It is independent of my normal hearing. If I close my eyes, it is not affected in any way. There are moments when it is so intense that I can actually tune it in by turning my body. It seems to be heightened in power by the presence of some other humans. I have the feeling that there is someone on the other end, or let me say that I have the feeling that the beam transcends time and space, and that I am hearing the sound of my transmitter echoed in incredible places. Lovecraft alluded to similar experiences, during which a sinister buzzing sound as a swarm of insects pervaded his astro-ordile sphere. But there are other explanations, one of which recalls the curious phenomenon in connection with Mayon, mentioned by Frater Achad in his unofficial correspondence. In 1926, Achad vibrated a magical word which he supposed filled the hiatus left by Crowley's inability to do so. In 1948, Achad visited the United States and there met a woman whom he knew to be psychic and to whom he had mentioned in a letter his belief that humanity had entered upon a new cycle, although he had not mentioned to her the word, vibratory or otherwise. However, when we were together, she immediately asked me to discuss my work on the inner planes. I told her I didn't do any that I knew of, other than during course of meditation, etc., but she said she wanted to know more about the word I taught the class to vibrate on the inner planes at night. She wouldn't believe me when I told her I was quite unaware of any such thing, but she said, "I'm there at the classes and you keep on explaining to about 30 of us just how to use this word of the Mayon." I had a devil of a job to persuade her that this was all new to me. We made another appointment at which I succeeded in getting her to write down phonetically some of the music she had been hearing, which I immediately recognized as very like those extraordinary Gnostic vibration names which appear in the Pistis Sophia and Chaldean oracles. I questioned her on that score, and she had never heard of them. Then I got her to go home and write out a longer passage. This she did and mailed to me. It was quite evident that she had been hearing some quite extraordinary method of using the very word, ma-ion, as a vibration of the inner planes. This was very interesting to me because I only used Mayon, the letters of the word in one arrangement, as the mark of the daughter cycle. My own method of pronouncing the word of 1926 is quite different, so that whatever she was getting was something entirely new to my conscious mind. He concluded the letter by advising his correspondent to put it in his files as a proof, believe it or not, that someone has been affected by a vibratory word which in that form I never consciously sent out. Maybe it's a side result, for the lesser cycle of the word in its original form as used in 1926. Be that as it may, the word Mayon in any arrangement, if vibrated, would bear a resemblance to the humming or buzzing of insects. Cameron was expected to enter into some sort of pact with the Indian witch woman, the terms of which she described, as most repugnant to me, since if it is not the holy power I seek, it is the deadliest weapon of the Black Brotherhood for certain. In another letter she tells Jane, "I carry within me something black and dreadful. It writhes in my womb like a monster of hell. The child ultimately born to Cameron did not live upon this earth, nor was it conceived here, but in the Mauve zone where it flourished a while. gained independent life, then vanished outside the circles of time. On March 17, 1953, Cameron wrote to Jane, "I will make a book of poems, songs of the witch woman, and I will illustrate it with my desire. When it is accomplished, the manifestation of my G-Wardian Asangel within me will be complete. I purchased all of the equipment for this undertaking today. It is interesting to note that the total of my purchase was 817, the reverse of 718 of the Esotella of our revealing itself." Here again is a reference via the backward way of the Mauve zone to Aosic Iwas, whose number in the OTO is 718, the number of the stele of revealing. 817 is the number of Amun, the hidden god or the concealed one, an accurate description of Ossic at the time of Cameron's workings, and a possible clue to the nature of the guardian angel which she concealed within herself as a magical child. The word stele means a stone. The Greek form of the word, Kathahi, suggests Cthulhu, a point made in the Schlangerkraft edition of the Necronomicon. 38. The stele has become associated generally with the stone commemorating the dead. In the Egyptian ritual, the stele more precisely commemorates the undead or the shade. The word also suggests a stellar connection, hence the astral shade. In the Necronomicon, Cthulhu is described not as dead but as dreaming, i.e. he exists as a shade at astral levels. In Crowley's Rite of the Star Ruby, mention is made of a stone in which the star of the six is fixed. This may be an indirect reference to the hexacontilithos, or 60 stone known to certain Chthonian entities, described by the historiographer Solinus.
They dwell in remote and secret places, and celebrate foul mysteries on savage hills. Nothing have they in common with men save the face, and the customs of humanity are wholly strange to them, and they hate the sun. They hiss rather than speak, their voices are harsh, and not to be heard without fear. They boast of a certain stone, which they call 60 stone, for they say that it displays 60 characters. And this stone has a secret and unspeakable name, which is Ixaxar.
The number of this unspeakable name is 333 from 41, which reveals its connection with the coronzonic current and which relates it directly with the Culifoth. This stone possesses a function similar to, but much greater than, that of the averse pentagram, which evokes the denizens of the Culifoth. In the Mayan languages, Ix is a feminine prefix. Girard observes that Ix enters into the names of lunar goddesses, hence the antipathy to the solar current. Furthermore, in one instance, it denotes the jaguar, which, in Mayan symbolism, equates with the demon. Ix also enters into names for the moon, in languages that have preserved their archaisms to any major degree. Thus, we have the ideas of Ixaxar expressed through a formal mythology which equates them with the moon, the female, lunar Kalis, and the Qlifoth, jaguar, feline, demon, etc. Crowley investigated the Kabbalistic properties of the word Xithahi in 1921. In May of that year, he noted in his magical record a disturbing experience which he describes as follows.
I tried hard to resume sleep for a few minutes, and was the prey of an hallucination of a most alarming kind, hearing a muffled knocking in slow cadence, as if
between two of the cubes. Folding her wings, she all but vanished from sight in the mauve-shadowed aperture. A slow but vibrant breeze arose and circulated round the crypt. It gathered the mist into a dense sphere of leprous green, which concentrated itself a little to the left of the aperture, but considerably above it. Out of its center emerged a fantastic form, unexpected no less by the participants than by the invited Wymases. It should be understood that Kamazots is an entity that has been for so long accepted as belonging to the myth patterns of the Mayas that its stylized astral appearance in response to appropriate spells would occasion little surprise. Imagine, therefore, the consternation arising from a manifestation so at variance with type as to seem essentially different. It emerged from the core of the greenish chaos and was projected, as by a positive and malign will, into the midst of the circle of worshippers. The clamour of the invocants had ceased. They simply stared mutely at the apparition, bat-like it was and dark, yet there the likeness stopped, for the tentacles writhing from the place where a face should have been were dripping with an oily mauve ichor, the slime of no terrestrial ocean. The compiler of these annals had not seen a representation of the fisherman's god of the Cook Islanders, but it would seem that, given the bat wings, this creature would most nearly compare in external appearance with the abnormality that appeared to the Zotsil. At this moment of ultimate tension and distress, Olga decided to open her wings and float majestically round the green wall of mist. As she passed between it and the Zotsil, the miasma seemed to emanate from its center a brighter luminosity which had the curious effect of enlarging Olga's wings so that they seemed to envelop the brooding form behind her. She appeared quite oblivious of the outre nature of the entity, which at that moment emitted a sibilant buzz, and with a fluttering of wings it snowed down upon the Zotsil the yellow pollen of astral flowers not growing in that shadowy wilderness. The superimposition of dye butterfly on the bat-shaped anomaly had the effect of creating an additional veil, yellow to its green, which, by virtue of its continual shudderings, resembled the slightly tremulous surface of a lake over which insects darted. It created a web of light and sound that served to deflea attention from the revolting rite enacted in the depths of the mist. For Olga, naked beneath her chrysalis of gossamer, was slowly sucked backwards into the heart of the vapor which had its source at the genital center of the bat-like squid. The vapor billowed from the scaly organ jutting from the globe of its belly, and recalled those crepuscular nightmares projected from astral realms by the genius of Wunderlich. The green mist subsided, and the enormous wings flapped convulsively, beating to dust Olga's fragile gossamer. She stood, stripped of gauze, a maenad aware of the import of her vampire role. Like a white arrow she clove the mist and fastened her lips upon the gigantic phallus. Her sheer whiteness was enveloped by a black cloud and the funnel of astral. Matter was sucked with shrill hissings down a crevice between cyclopean stones. This abrupt withdrawal created a vortex which absorbed all within its immediate neighborhood. Olga's garments vanished with incredible rapidity and were never seen again. But she emerged from the rite renewed, revitalized, relieved, perhaps forever, from a magical commitment of many years' standing. It also resolved a psychological complex which had until then prevented her achieving the height of her chosen profession, that of choreographic self-expression. She eventually accompanied the most accomplished dancers in a troupe which performed, in the 1960s, before one of the most renowned lamas of Nepal.